and welcome to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. I'm Dr. Nerida, PhD equine nutritionist, founder of the My Happy Horse Nutrition app, and enthusiastic avoider of any winter sport that involves snow, ice, speed, or me falling over. But despite my personal lack of talent in the snow, I do spend a lot of my career helping horses through winter, including horses on major breeding farms in very cold climates like Hokkaido, Japan. Winter can be a tricky time of year, especially if you have a horse that loses weight easily. In this episode, we'll talk all things winter nutrition, including preparing early, feeding plenty of forage, checking body condition regularly, adjusting the diet when needed, keeping the diet balanced, and being extra careful with laminitis-prone horses. We'll also look at why hay helps keep horses warm from the inside out and why good winter feeding is really about staying ahead of problems before they show up. Before we dive in, if this podcast helps you feel more confident feeding your horse, please follow the show. Then you won't miss future episodes and it helps others find us. Now, let's talk about feeding horses in winter. As is the case with many things in life, excellent preparation for winter is key to your horse coming out the other side in exactly the condition you want. And I thought I'd start in that place because coming out the other side in exactly the condition you want differs for a lot of people depending on the horse. So for 4 of my horses, coming out the other side of winter means that they will be lighter in condition than what they started at the beginning of winter. And that's exactly where I want them. So they're good doers. They tend to put on weight really easily. And I actually use winter to pull some weight off them. Now, a lot of other people, and for a couple of my horses, so we have LA, our off-the-track Thoroughbred, and Old Breezy, our very old mare, I want them to come out the other side of winter in really good condition. I don't want them to lose weight during winter. So depending on the horse and your goal, feeding in winter can look a little bit different based on what you're trying to achieve. But preparing early looks similar for everyone. So if you do have a horse that is prone to losing weight over winter, preparing early for that horse would look like having that horse in good condition throughout summer and into autumn. And it's a little bit easier to keep weight on horses when the climate is warmer. And the reason for that is that when the climate's warm, they don't have to burn up so much energy or calories. The two terms are interchangeable, mean the same thing. They don't need to burn up so many calories to produce body heat and keep their body temperature at the right temperature. When it's very cold in winter or cold, and particularly cold and wet, they have to burn a lot of calories just to generate body heat so that as warm-blooded animals, they can maintain their body temperature in the very strict range it needs to stay in. Because if the body temperature of any warm-blooded animal falls too low, as can happen in hypothermia, or if they're not producing enough body heat or they're not able to keep up with the amount of body heat they need to produce because it's so cold, you get all sorts of problems with hypothermia. So they put a lot of energy into maintaining their body temperature so that their body and all their body functions continue to work. So it is a lot easier to put weight on and also keep weight on horses when the conditions are warmer. So if you have a horse that is prone to losing weight in the depths of winter, it is a really good idea to get them to just put a little bit of extra weight on in the summer or the fall so that you have them in a good place going into winter and you're not trying to put weight on them when the climate is also very cold and their energy requirements are higher because of the cold weather. So that's one part of preparing early. Obviously, if you've got good doers, then it's a constant battle. I feel you. It is a constant battle to keep weight off them. And I always look forward to winter. Like I don't know that I'm going to get my prayers answered here with Popcorn this year. She's way more overweight than what she should be coming into this winter. But I'm really crossing my fingers that maybe we'll get at least some rain in winter and create the conditions that will strip some weight off her. But with the good doers, we're always managing them to manage their weight. So there's not so much to think about in terms of preparing early for winter for them, other than just trying not to let them get too heavy in condition so winter doesn't have to do too much work in pulling that weight off them. The other thing that is really good to think about coming into winter is your horse fed a balanced diet that is going to keep them just generally healthy and with really good immune function? So they can tend to be more prone, as we are as humans, more prone to infectious diseases throughout winter, so snotty noses and coughs and colds sort of things. But if they've got good immune function and their diet is supporting that immune function, so for example, you know that their requirement for selenium and zinc and vitamin E and iodine, all of these things that are important for correct metabolism and correct immune function, and their gut is healthy, because so much of their immune system is resident inside their gut, so they need really good gut health to have good immune health. If we make sure that all of that is in place coming into winter, then if some virus does happen to land with your horse, they'll be in the best possible position to then fight that off. I had a really good demonstration of the importance of immune function for actually coping with infectious diseases when equine influenza made it into Australia. It must have been in 2008, if my memory serves me correctly. And we'd never had it here, so all of our horses were very naive to this disease, and it went flying through our equine population. And I remember thinking it was so interesting watching. I was doing a lot of work at that time on the ground on big thoroughbred breeding farms in the Hunter Valley of New South Wales, and everyone was in a bit of a panic because equine influenza was coming through. It must have been like September, October, coming through when broodmares were in really early stages of pregnancy. And I remember some of the farms I was working with panicking, thinking that these mares were going to lose these early pregnancies and, that there'd be lots of complications. But the mares got sick for sure, and some of them needed some help with anti-inflammatories and various things to help them get through the really acute stage. But then they recovered, and we lost no more early pregnancies than what you would lose in a normal season. And there was very, very few, and in fact, I don't remember any cases that I actually had to help out with, but very few cases of horses that were continued to be sick and got secondary complications. And yet, where I was living at the time, there was lots of very small acreages and lots of backyard ponies, essentially. And the backyard ponies, there was a number of them that I knew of that actually died from the equine influenza. And it wasn't from the equine influenza itself. It was from complications that arose from not being able to fight the disease off. So they'd get pneumonia or something similar, and they would actually either be euthanized or pass away from the condition. It was really sad. And I remember thinking at the time, why are these horses so affected, and yet the horses in the Hunter Valley not so much? And the only thing I could put it down to from a nutritionist perspective was that the horses in the Hunter Valley, I knew they were on balanced diets because I was working with them and making sure that the diets being fed were good. So I knew that they had the nutrients they needed to mount an immune response, or to support their immune system, so their immune system could mount an immune response. The backyard ponies, on the other hand, a lot of them aren't fed balanced diets, and some of them potentially hadn't been fed balanced diets for decades. And so when they were actually challenged, because we actually don't have, we're so fortunate here in Australia, we don't have a lot of infectious conditions that affect our horses like we do in other parts of the world. So we're lucky in that respect, but this was a really good example of, if a horse doesn't have the nutritional foundation to mount an immune response, they can't mount a full immune response, and they are much more susceptible to infectious disease. So coming into winter, it's great to have that in mind, to make sure that you are feeding a balanced diet. This is where the My Happy Horse nutrition app is your best friend, because you can put in what you're feeding your horse and it will show you really clearly and very quickly whether you are actually meeting all of your horse's nutrient requirements or not. You'll be able to see, if there is a zinc deficiency, you'll be able to see that. So it's a great idea as early as possible, either run an analysis on the diet yourself using My Happy Horse, or ask a nutritionist to run an analysis on the diet for you, and make sure you get your horses onto a diet that is supporting all of their nutritional requirements, meeting all of their requirements before winter hits. And then the other part of preparation is just getting yourself ready in terms of hay supply. So a lot of you will be very familiar with having to have hay on hand if you live in cold and snowy conditions, and you are used to fully hand feeding your horses all the way through winter. You'll be very used to, making sure that you do have adequate hay supplies. Where I live, we're very fortunate in that pasture will grow through, and in fact, we grow some of our best pastures through our winter. So we are not often in the position where we do have to feed all hay, like provide all of our horses' forage requirements throughout winter. This year, 2026, might be a little bit different as it's very, very dry, and a lot of us are watching our pasture reserves slowly disappear. I am fortunate in that I do still have a lot of grass left, but I'm starting to think maybe I really should be buying hay just in case it doesn't rain anytime soon. But if you know that you're going to need hay, then your best option, if you've got somewhere to store it, is to buy it in summer when the hay is being made and the prices are normally lower, the quality is normally higher, and you can take your choice of hay that is available as opposed to taking what you can get in the middle of winter if you leave it late to buy hay. I know a lot of people don't have ability to store hay, and if that's the case, then you'll just have to, as you do already, do your best to find the best type of hay for your horse with what you can get at the time when you need to go and buy it. And again, if you are changing, especially hay types and hay qualities, it's really important to keep checking your horse's diet to make sure that you're still meeting all of the nutrient requirements. So if you go from, having a combination of good quality grassy hay and good quality alfalfa hay, and then all of a sudden the next hay you buy is much lower quality, checking your horse's diet, doing an analysis on your horse's diet to make sure that you're still meeting protein requirements and that there's enough of the other nutrients, and particularly things like vitamin E that disappear out of hay, making sure that you're still meeting those requirements. But if you can get in and buy hay early, absolutely brilliant thing to do, and you should do that every summer, especially if you know that you're going to need hay throughout the winter. So we'll move on from preparation. And then the first thing I really want you to think about when feeding horses in winter is forage. So it's always the most important thing to think about in a horse's diet. And in winter, we get this added importance of forage. And the added importance is that it's actually fibre that ferments in the horse's hindgut that produces a lot of heat and keeps them warm from the inside out. We can underestimate the importance of that source of heat. So when bacteria and fungi are fermenting fibre, one of the byproducts of that fibre fermentation is heat. So it's literally like your horse has got a heater right inside its body, and then that heat sort of dissipates out into the body. And it means that the bacteria and fungi are producing heat for the horse, and the horse is not having to burn its own calories up to produce body heat to stay warm. So it saves your horse a lot of energy having that fibre fermentation going on in the hindgut. I think a really, really stark example of how important the heat of fermentation is for me in maintaining body heat was when we had big floods go through North Queensland. If I thought about it hard enough, I'd be able to remember the year. It was around 2019, and it could have been winter of 2018, but it was like very dramatic flooding. And what I remember from that flooding is how many cattle actually died. It was so sad watching it all happen. It was a lot of cattle. And in 2019, I actually travelled through some of the areas. So we went through Julia Creek, and we stopped off, and my parents had gone and worked on a station up there. My mum taught the kids, and we met those kids. They were a lot older by the time I met them, and Dad had just done various things around the farm. So we driving past, and we literally just drove in to say hello, which, when you're that isolated, it's not often that people just drive in off the road to say hello. And we spent some time with the family, and one of the stories they told us, and they told us because we were out with them the next day with some cattle, and they had this mob of Brahman calves. They were so cute, and they were all orphans from the flood. And I remember thinking to myself, how did a calf survive, but its mother didn't? Because, you talk about the podcast episode about weanlings, which is about number 50, I think. I talk about their surface area to volume ratio and how, because they're so small, they've actually got a big surface area to a small volume. And that means that they've got lots of surface area in contact with the cold in cold climates. And they just naturally offload a lot of heat. And it means that they need to burn up more energy than a bigger horse. that's got a lower surface area to volume ratio to stay warm. So it didn't make sense to me that the calves were okay with their high surface area to volume ratio, and yet their mothers had died in the flooding and they had much lower surface area to volume ratio. But what this family explained to me, what their explanation for it was because everything was underwater, those cows had no access to any kind of fibre. And so eventually their rumen emptied, and then they were no longer getting any heat whatsoever from their rumen. And their Boss Indicus cattle, they're designed to offload heat. They've got like big floppy skin areas and long ears to offload heat. And so they ran out of internal heat coming from their rumen because there was no fibre in them anymore, and they were offloading massive amounts of heat through their giant skin surface, and it was actually hypothermia that was killing them. But the calves were still getting milk from their mothers. So they were okay because they still had food going through their gut and they were still getting nutrition, whereas their mothers didn't. I thought, wow, that was just so fascinating to see that, you would think that the cows would be so much more susceptible to hypothermia, but because they could still feed off their mums, they seemed to be okay. And I mean, they were there. They were living proof that they survived and their mothers didn't. So that was just a really dramatic demonstration of how important this heat of fermentation is for animals like horses that have got these internal fermentation chambers. So it's so important to make sure that they're getting enough forage. It's tempting in winter to want to not think about forage so much and go for hard feed, grain-based feeds or high-energy fibres or things like that. But you absolutely must in winter make sure that they're getting enough forage. I would say in winter that, the published minimum amount of forage for any horse is 1.5% of body weight. I would say if you've got horses in very cold climates, and particularly if they're living outside in very cold climates, the minimum you should be aiming for forage is 2%. And if you can give them more like 2.5% of their body weight, which is 12.5 kilograms per day for a 500 kilogram horse, that will just make sure that you're putting enough fibre into that hindgut to produce enough heat to keep them warm. So the amount is really important. And keeping an eye on, I'll talk a little bit more about adjusting for conditions soon, but for my horses, it does get quite cold where I am, and it also can be quite wet in winter. So as soon as they're wet, of course, they lose their insulation from their coat. It's an interesting point to note that horses, when a horse is dry, their comfortable lowest temperature is minus 15 degrees Celsius, so well below freezing. That's where they're comfortable too, essentially. That's Nerida's dead territory, but horses are comfortable down to minus 15. If they are wet, their comfortable temperature is 15 degrees. And then anything below that, they feel really cold. So it's 30 degrees Celsius. And if you speak in Fahrenheit, I'd really encourage you to grab your phone and put that into a Google search or a AI and ask them to convert what's minus 15 degrees Celsius and what's 15 degrees Celsius. And you'll see it's a very, very broad, like 30 degrees difference, their comfort range. So if your horses are wet, they do feel the cold. So, and I don't rug my horses. My horses have got a giant shelter shed that they can all get in under. And I also want a lot of them to lose weight. So I tend to, hope that it rains to make them burn up calories to produce body temperature, body heat. But I can't stand seeing them cold and miserable. If they're shivering, I will go out and put rugs on them, or usually before they get to that point, I'll go out and put rugs on them because I absolutely can't stand them, seeing them wet and cold. And the other thing that I will do is I'll give them hay, because they will often, come into their shelter or just, stand there with their backs to the wind and their tail jammed down between their legs and their head down, sort of trying to stay as sheltered from the rain that's coming at them as possible, but they don't go and graze. So particularly if it's horses that you are concerned about losing weight, you don't want them to lose weight, then the best thing you can possibly give those horses at that time is forage. One, because they'll probably have stopped grazing if that's their source of fibre, and two, because in those conditions their calorie requirements will have increased because they're wet, and then their comfortable temperature is now 30 degrees higher than would have otherwise been if they were dry and had their had their coat all fluffed up. Of course, if your horse is rugged, that's not as applicable because the rug should be keeping them nice and dry and nice and warm. But for horses that are just living out and they don't have rugs on, the best possible thing to give them when it's really cold, and especially cold and wet, is some extra hay. So the other thing to think about with forage throughout winter, and especially if it's their only source of forage, so if you do live in one of those climates where your ground is covered in snow all winter and your horses are just eating hay, the quality of that forage becomes very important because you are now solely responsible for providing them with forage, and you have to be conscious of what nutrients that forage is providing to your horse. So again, it depends on the horse as to whether you need to provide really good quality forage. So if you've got hard keepers and you're struggling to maintain weight on horses over winter, then you'll be wanting to feed them really good quality forage. Or if you've got, lactating broodmares, so in Japan on the farms that I work with, they're foaling in January and there's snow everywhere. So they've got these lactating broodmares in the snow with their foals, and they come in for periods of time to the barns, but they do also spend a lot of time outside. So for those mares, they feed the highest quality hay we can find because their energy requirements are so high. We need to give them really good quality forage. On the flip side of that, you talk about good doers and these horses that just seem to stay fat no matter what you feed them. The quality is also important because we want to give them hay that is low enough quality that they can have lots of it without making them too fat. So we can start going and finding very poor quality grassy hay and other forages like that, so that they've got lots and lots to chew on, but they're not getting so many calories out of that hay that they'll actually put on weight during winter. There was a great study, and I apologise, I should have looked it up to get the authors. It was a UK group. They did a study where they fed ponies half grassy hay and half straw, and I think the control group was just the grassy hay. Don't quote me on that, but it was something like that. But the horses that were on 50% hay, 50% straw lost weight during winter, and that was the intention. So straw is great. I use it a lot with my own horses, and in fact, right now they have a hay feeder full of straw. So if they, run out of grass in their strips and they are still wanting something to chew on, they come back and they chew on straw. It gives them something to chew. It satisfies them mentally, and it allows that behaviour of chewing, which they're so wired for, but it doesn't blow their calorie budgets. It doesn't make them put on weight. So straw is your best friend if you have got really good doers. And then the other thing I just want to touch on here, and there is, if you go back to somewhere around episode 10 of the Happy Horse Nutrition podcast, there is an episode about feeding for hindgut health. And I talk there a lot about fibre variety and how important fibre variety is in a horse's diet, because horses evolved over 55 million years, and we've only been in their lives for just over 4,500 years. So when you work that out, we've been in their lives for 0.01% of their time, or said another way, they've been on Earth for 99.99% of the time without humans being involved in their life. And one of the biggest things we've done is change the way they eat. So when they have been evolving, they've been able to roam widely, and over a period of 12 months, they would graze and browse and nibble at lots and lots of different plant species, and their hindgut microbiome functions best for them in pretty much every way when it's really diverse. So when there's lots of different species, and when the species are pretty evenly distributed, so there's not one or a couple of bacteria or fungi that are actually taking over the hindgut. But what happens when we restrict their fibre diversity right down? So say you've got a horse, it's winter, it's snow on the ground, and you're feeding them hay. If you're giving them just round bales of Timothy hay, for example, and that's the only forage that they're getting, you've now restricted their fibre diversity right down to one plant. That's it. And so what happens that you can't see in the hindgut is that you then also start to restrict down the microbe diversity. And when you restrict down the microbe diversity, you end up with a microbial population that is less resilient, so it's much easier to knock them out into a state of dysbiosis, so they unbalance them and then they stay unbalanced. And horses become more prone to problems like colic. It's fascinating to me when we get a weather change here, particularly in winter. You get a weather change, it'll rain, for example, and then a lot of the vets will say, gosh, we've had so many colics. And it always makes me wonder whether, because, my natural reaction when we have rain is I'll go and feed my horses grass hay, and they're not necessarily on that grassy hay, but because they're grazing all the time, but then I'll go out and just give them some grassy hay, which is, a big no-no in a lot of ways in horse nutrition, to all of a sudden introduce another ingredient into a horse's diet. But I never worry about doing that because I know that my horse's hindguts are healthy. They've got a really, really diverse pasture, so the fibre diversity in their diet is really high, and then their microbial population should be really high, and so they tend to be very robust like that. I can throw them grass hay or loosen hay or whatever I happen to give them if it's really cold and wet, and they're okay. But a lot of horses will get colic if you do that to them. So for that reason, and for all of the other reasons I talk about in the podcast about feeding for hindgut health, it's really important to think about forage diversity. So if your horses are completely reliant on hay, try to give them access to multiple different types of grassy hay, and also bring legumes in there. So bring alfalfa in, or clover in, or both. And if there's other types of hay that you have available then that are safe for horses, then bring some of that in too. And it can be that you just have one type of hay that is ad lib. So you might have, a lower quality ad lib grassy hay, and then you feed them a measured amount of all of the other hays each day so that they're eating them. But, I couldn't put ad lib loosen hay out for my horses because they would just stand there and eat all of it. So I always feed loosen hay in measured amounts. So, they'll get 1 biscuit or 2 biscuits a day, whatever, and they have that, and then they'll have either ad lib grassy hay or they're out on their pasture. But just try and work with your forages and bring in as many different types of forages as you can, and then you're increasing fibre diversity in your horse's diet, which is increasing microbial diversity in your horse's hindgut. And honestly, I could stand here and talk to you for several hours about the benefits that has for your horse's health. And I do talk about it in a lot of episodes of the Happy Horse Nutrition podcast. So I'd love you to go back and listen to, there's a few episodes around episode 10 about hindgut health and microbes. And of course, the episode with Dr. Belinda talking about the hindgut microbes and their impact on everything, that is also a great episode to listen to, give you a lot more background on why it's important. But for the purposes of this podcast, just try and bring in as many different types of forages as you can. It has so many benefits for your horse. It's worth the effort doing it. Hey, quick pause. If you're trying to figure out what to feed your horse, you don't have to do it solo. The My Happy Horse app helps you make sense of nutrition clearly, calmly, and without overwhelm. It's like having me in your pocket when you need reassurance the most. Visit myhappy.horse or grab it from the App Store. Okay, let's get back into it. The other thing that I'll just touch on here when we're talking about forage is that be aware of our tendency, and I'm putting myself in this group too because I have exactly the same tendency, but be aware of our tendency as horse people to want to go and reach for some sort of bagged feed when our horses are needing more nutrient during winter. So I found myself doing it last winter with Alay, our off the track. It was her first year off the track last winter, and I was really conscious of her body condition. And I'm finding myself doing it now with our old mare Breeze, as we haven't really hit very cold weather yet, but our pasture quality has certainly dropped off because it's so dry. And I'm finding in my head going, I need to go and get her, some sort of grain-based feed or bagged feed. And then I'll catch myself and go, hang on a minute. The reason that she is not holding her weight as easily as she was before is because the forage quality has dropped right off. So rather than compensating for forage quality that's dropped off with a bag feed, which can be part of it, but before you do that, try to increase the forage quality of the diet by bringing in a really high quality forage. So in my case, I would just bring in a couple of kilograms of lucerne per day, which I've done now. And that is what will support them. It'll support the best quality gut health, and it'll also support them in getting the protein that they need and the calories they need before you have to go for some sort of fortified grain or high energy fibre based feed. So the likelihood is that if you've got a poor doer, you will also need to do that at some point throughout winter, but don't make it your first step. Resist that temptation to go and grab a bag of something and just increase the quality of the forage that's already in the diet. It has the additional benefit of adding to the heater. So the more fibre you put into your horse in winter, the more heat they get out of their hindgut. So it's got a couple of benefits, or a number of benefits, using high quality forage instead of immediately grabbing for a bag. The next thing to think about in winter, or the next thing to do when you're winter feeding your horses, is condition score your horses regularly, and condition score them with your hands on them and their rugs. If you have got your horses rugged, their rugs off. So where a lot of people get into trouble with feeding in winter is that we'll put a rug on a horse and we won't necessarily be taking that rug off every day, and they get all fuzzy and furry, of course, in winter. So it's a lot harder to see their body condition. And then all of a sudden they go from they were okay to they've dropped a heap of weight. And now you're in this situation where you're not only having to maintain their weight, you're having to get them to gain weight. And that's a lot harder to do. And it's hard to do in winter because it's so cold, and often pastures are either non-existent or the quality is poor. So best case scenario is to prevent weight loss in the first place, and to be on top of any changes that might be happening before they get too dramatic, so that you don't end up in this situation where you've got a horse that's too thin and you're having to put weight on. So really important, take the rugs off at a minimum weekly. I mean, I like to have them off if I've got rugs on, like to have them off every day, but I also know that that's sometimes not logistically possible. But at a minimum weekly, and then when you do take their rugs off, make sure you put your hands on them, feel the neck. So pinch up the skin about in the middle of the neck where the mane comes out, and see if you can feel any change there. So a horse that's overweight, the neck will often be quite firm, and a horse that's too skinny, you'll be picking up the skin and there'll be no filling there whatsoever. So if you feel changes there, and there's a loss of a little bit of fat, or a loss of a lot of fat in there, that tells you that conditions changing. And then the big tell is, their ribs. So running your hands over their ribs in winter is really important, because the fluff on them can actually hide what's actually going on underneath. So you might be looking at them going, I can't see their ribs, but then when you put your hands on them, you go, oh wow, their ribs are like right there, and there's absolutely no cover over their ribs whatsoever. So make sure you do condition score them, and the condition score you want to keep your horse in winter is going to depend on the horse. So I always say, if you can see the ribs really easily, they're too skinny, and if you can't feel the ribs without pushing quite hard, they're too fat. And everything else in the middle, just depending on what the horse is doing, is okay. So do catch weight loss early, or weight gain. If you've got a good doer and you've got good pasture and you don't want them to gain weight and they're actually gaining weight over winter, then it's important to catch that early as well. But it's mainly weight loss that we want to catch, and make sure that it doesn't run away on us too far before we realise that the horse is losing some weight and we need to adjust the diet. So if you do notice that your horse is losing weight and you don't want them to lose weight in winter, there's a few things you can do. So number one would be increase the quality of the forage. So if your pasture quality is dropped off, or if your hay quality is not great, finding a really high quality, higher energy hay like alfalfa hay to bring into the diet will absolutely help. And making sure that they're getting enough forage so that they've got all that internal heating and they're not having to burn up too much energy to maintain their body temperature for themselves. And then bringing in, if you need to, bringing in higher energy, either fortified feeds, or if you're feeding a balancer pellet or a vitamin and mineral supplement, putting in higher energy ingredients on top of that. So you could use fibres, things like beet pulp or copper meal, or lupin hulls, or well-processed soybean hulls, things like that can be used. Or if you can feed grains, and oats is great because it's high in fibre and it creates that fermentation heat when it's being digested, and it's also a nice safe grain. It's digestible in the small intestine. Or you could use extruded stabilized rice bran or some sort of extruded, very digestible grain feed. Or you could use fortified feeds that are digestible and contain ingredients that will be agreeable with your horse. So make sure you read your ingredient listings. If the feed is grain-based, make sure that it is cooked so that the grain is actually digestible. I talk about that a lot in episode 45 of the Happy Horse Nutrition podcast, so feeding grain safely to horses, cooked versus uncooked, and why it matters. So it's really, really important in winter particularly that you feed cooked grains. One, because your horse needs to be able to digest the grain in order to extract their energy. And two, is the last thing you want to do in winter is have any kind of negative impact on their hindgut microbes, because it's the microbes that are there fermenting the fibre, giving your horse the energy from the fibre and giving your horse the heat from the fibre. So it's super important to make sure that you look after the hindgut microbes during winter. And a big part of that, if you're feeding grain, is to make sure you are feeding cooked grains. Oil's a really useful energy source during winter as well, especially if you've got a horse that doesn't have a great appetite. So bringing in oil can really increase their calorie intake without increasing the bulk of their feed. And it has the added little benefit of sometimes in really cold conditions, horses can get dry skin, a little bit like us, I guess. So bringing in some oil makes sure that you are meeting their essential fatty acid requirements, so both omega-6 and omega-3. And the other thing is, if you're feeding hay, or if your pasture quality drops right off, or if you're like me at the moment and in droutish conditions and the pasture is dead and brown, there's not a lot of oils in any of those forages. So bringing in something like a canola oil or a flaxseed oil, or I actually quite like a 50-50 blend of canola oil and flaxseed oil over winter, and that brings in both omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids, so that you're meeting your horse's requirements for those nutrients as well. A lot of feeding in winter is about staying one step ahead of the game, and a part of that is adjusting for conditions. So if it's really wet and really cold, feed more, because your horse is going to be burning up more calories in those conditions. Really important for, in the episode about feeding weanlings, which was episode 50, talks about how important it is with weanlings to be constantly anticipating what they need in terms of calories and constantly adjusting their diet. And a big part of that is adjusting it for cold weather. But it's the same for all horses. So if it's particularly cold, and especially if it's wet and cold, make sure they get more forage. But also if you're struggling to maintain weight on them, increase the energy in their diet by increasing the high energy ingredients in their diet as well. If you want help sort of doing these calculations and seeing how much you're increasing energy intake, or you want to increase it by a certain amount at certain times, you can definitely use the My Happy Horse Nutrition app to help you do all of these diet adjustments. But really it comes down to, if it's wet and cold, feed more forage, feed more hard feed, and just increase the energy intake for your horse so that they've got more energy they can burn up for maintaining body weight without actually losing body condition. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that just feeding more hard feed is what they need, because it's actually the fibre, the forages that will keep them warm when they ferment in the hindgut. So go for more forage first, and then if you need to, with horses that are really susceptible to cold weather like weanlings, then you can also increase their hard feed. Something that can be forgotten easily in winter is the importance of salt and water. So we think about salt and water a lot when it's hot and our horses, are sweating a lot, or, we know that they are needing a lot of electrolyte and a lot of water in hot conditions. But in wintertime, we can forget about that a little bit, because we're not naturally as thirsty ourselves during winter, and we kind of just, I should speak personally, I don't think about water for me nearly as much in wintertime, because I don't feel the thirst that I feel in our very hot summers. But if we don't focus on water in winter, there can be a couple of pretty severe consequences. So the first one, really obvious one, will be if your horse doesn't drink enough for some reason, then their gut contents dry out and they are at high risk of impaction colic. The other thing that they will do, if they're not drinking enough, then they also won't eat, because when you're thirsty, you tend not to want to eat. And I know this is true for us as humans, and it's definitely true for our horses. I remember, must be 10 years ago, I was working with a farm in Japan, and this was before I'd ever been there, so I didn't really have a great concept of what life was like in Japan for a young horse through winter. But I was looking at a lot of growth curves for this one particular farm, and I couldn't figure out, when everything looked so good with their diet, I could not figure out why they basically slammed the brakes on with growth over winter. Like, what is wrong with these horses? You know, their diet looks like it should be, even with the very cold conditions, it should be providing enough energy for them to at least grow a little bit, and they would almost all just stop growing. What I eventually figured out with them was that this farm didn't have heated water troughs. So these young horses were going out at night and it can be -20, which is super cold for me. We get down to maybe -5 Celsius where I live, but -20 is very cold for me. And so it's proper cold. And what they would do is they would put hot water in their troughs of an evening when they went out of the barn. And then at some point overnight, that water would cool down so much that the whole trough would just freeze. And so there would be periods of time, obviously the water was too hot to drink, and then there would have been a short period of time where it was just the right temperature to drink, and then a period of time where it's too cold to drink, and then it's frozen. You're licking an icy pole to get any kind of water. And the impact that then had was that when they couldn't drink, they also wouldn't eat hay. So I was making the assumption that they were eating a certain amount of hay based on normal intake, based on normal water intake, but they actually weren't eating that much hay because they couldn't drink. And the only way we could solve that problem was to actually put water heaters in these water troughs so that they had temperature that was at a really nice drinkable temperature all the time, so that whenever they wanted to drink, they had access to water. So it makes a massive difference whether they will drink or not. So water that's too cold, and obviously water that's frozen, is a problem for water intake. Water that is not clean enough is also a problem. And it's really fascinating watching Alay and Breeze here. So they have access to a dam, which is it's a normal farm dam. It's not really clean water, but it's also not water you would look at and go, that's dirty dam water. And I have a trough for them that we fill up with fresh water and make sure it's cleaned out and lovely and clean all the time. And they exclusively drink from that trough. They never go and drink from the dam. So it's really interesting. And even sometimes I close the gate so that Alay is out of the yard where the trough is while the other horses are eating their feed, because she'll come over. She's so tall, she just sticks her head over the fence and eats everyone else's feed. So we have to lock her out when we feed her, but then she can't get to the trough. And it's just a thing my horses will eat, and then they'll go and have a drink straight away, which I think is pretty normal for most horses. And she will stand at that gate. She could just go and walk 20 steps to the dam and have a drink. She will stand at that gate and wait for that gate to open so she can go in and drink from the trough. So water quality is really important to them. It makes perfect sense. We like drinking clean water. I know I take my kids and we'll go and stay somewhere in a town, and they're so used to drinking tank water, which tastes so different to town water, that they'll often just not drink very much because the town water doesn't taste nice to them, so they don't want to drink it. So we're all affected by water quality. Stock are definitely affected by water quality, and it is so important. So do, in winter, be really conscious of cleaning your troughs out regularly and making sure that your horses are drinking enough. And salt is also important. So don't fall into the trap of thinking, it's cold and they're not sweating and they don't really need salt, because they need salt all the time. And I notice my horses will eat salt 12 months of the year. So do make sure that you've got salt out for them. My preference is to use like fine rock salt, so just loose salt, because that's easiest for them to lick up and eat. You can use salt blocks. I don't love salt blocks for horses because their tongues are so soft and it actually hurts their tongue to lick a salt block very much. So the loose salt is better for them. But just do make sure that you've got salt out for them. And then that also feeds into their water intake. So if they're sodium deficient, they'll also not drink as much as they should. So making sure they've got enough salt, then make sure that they drink enough, and then that makes sure that they eat enough, which is important for maintaining weight on horses that lose weight in winter. And for all horses, it's important that they drink enough so that they're not going to get impaction colic. A couple of things just to wrap this up. So it's always important to feed a balanced diet. We've talked about this a little bit already at the beginning of this podcast. It's so important for immune function, but it's also important from the perspective, let's say, of maintaining muscle over winter. So especially if you're in a climate where you're only feeding hay, when you get to about 6 months after the hay has been harvested, the vitamin A and vitamin E content of that hay will be really low. So if you've got a horse that becomes vitamin E deficient because it doesn't have any access to green pasture and it's on a hay-based diet and you're not supplementing properly with vitamin E, you can start to see muscle wastage because of vitamin E deficiency. So it's a really important deficiency to be aware of, but there's lots of other deficiencies that we need to be aware of and catch. Again, the easiest way to do that is to use My Happy Horse. It will actually ask you when the hay that your horse is eating was harvested, and then it will adjust the vitamin content of that hay according to the age of the hay. So it will catch things like vitamin A deficiency, which will affect immune function, or vitamin E deficiency, which is going to affect muscling, and a whole lot of other things. But it'll catch those deficiencies for you and make sure that you're using a balancer pellet or a vitamin and mineral supplement or a fortified feed in the correct way to top up all of those nutrients and make sure that your horse is having their daily nutrient requirements met. Protein quality is an important consideration, and in fact, if you listen to episode 51, I talk about protein quality in a horse's diet. So again, really important for horses that tend to lose weight over winter, making sure that they've got enough protein and also enough good quality protein in their diet to maintain weight and muscle mass. And the last little thing that I just wanted to touch on was laminitis. So winter can be a particularly risky time for laminitis, but I made myself laugh when I was just jotting notes down before I recorded this podcast, thinking, yeah, winter can be a risky time, but it made me think of that Mark Twain quote where it says, October, this is one of the peculiarly, that's a hard word to say, peculiarly dangerous months to speculate in stocks. The others are July, January, September, April, November, May, March, June, December, August, and February. So I always think of that quote when I say to people, spring is a really risky time for laminitis, but so is summer, winter, fall. Like every season there is a risk of laminitis, but winter can be risky, and particularly if you've got pasture in the later parts of winter, because the days start to get longer, but the nights are so cold. So the plants tend to do that thing where they will produce non-structural carbohydrate during the day when it's sunny, but then they shut down. They don't metabolize anything overnight, so they accumulate non-structural carbohydrate. And it can also be risky if you've got a horse that is solely reliant on hay and it's a laminitis-prone horse, and you happen to get a hay that has got too much non-structural carbohydrate in it. So you just need to be really aware of what your forages are doing if you've got a horse that is prone to laminitis. If you can, buy hay that comes with an analysis so that you know what the starch plus water-soluble carbohydrate content is. And just be really, really conscious of when you're allowing horses to graze over winter if they have had laminitis before, or if they are prone to laminitis. So if you want to just brush up your knowledge on laminitis and put your mind at ease that you're managing horses in the right way, go back and listen to episode 15, which is all about laminitis. And there's also an episode about non-structural carbohydrate. So episode 40, what is NSC and is it bad for my horse? So that's a good one to listen to as well as you are feeding in winter. if you've got a horse prone to laminitis. And even if you don't have a horse prone to laminitis, it is still important to be conscious of the non-structural carbohydrate content of the forage you're feeding. So, for example, if you are feeding a cereal hays can accumulate massive amounts of non-structural carbohydrate. And for any horse, that can have some negative impacts on hindgut health, which is something that you do want to avoid during winter. So to wrap this one up, winter feeding really comes back to just staying one step ahead of your horse, making sure that they're well prepared coming into winter, making sure that you've got forage on hand if that's possible for you coming into winter. And then, as winter arrives and you're in the thick of it, just continually adjusting the diet according to what you see your horse needs or what the weather says your horse is going to need. So the important things, make sure you feed enough forage, because it is that fibre fermentation in their hindgut that is what does a lot of the work in keeping them warm, and that's really important. Reduces the amount of work their body needs to do to stay warm and reduces their calorie requirements and helps them to maintain weight. Super, super important. Do keep checking body condition with your hands, rugs off, to catch any changes in condition early before it becomes a real problem that you need to fix in the middle of winter, which becomes very difficult. Be conscious of making sure that they're drinking enough water, that they've got salt available so that they drink well, then reduce their risk of impaction colic, and they'll eat well so they'll maintain weight. If you've got good doers, use winter. Don't rug your horses. Let them be out and a la natural, but really use winter to let them burn up body condition to stay warm throughout winter. Because when you think about the natural evolutionary cycle of a horse, they went through all of the seasons, so they've got this real thrifty gene that makes them do so well on very, very little feed. But the thing was, when they were living in the wild, they would do really well through spring and summer, and then these really severe winters would hit, whereas snow, and they wouldn't have very much access to good quality feed, and they'd have to travel long distances to find feed and things like that. So they would lose a lot of weight over winter, and then they'd come out into spring and summer and put that weight back on again. So it was this up and down cycle. What tends to happen with our modern day horses is they put on weight, and then we look after them through winter so they don't really lose any weight, and then they put on more weight in spring and summer, and then we look after them again. So it's just this up and up of body condition. So let winter do its natural job. Let winter strip some weight off them if that's what your horse needs. Honestly, I love winter for that reason, for my good doers. And then there's lots of things that we talked about for helping you keep weight on your horses that you don't want to lose weight. It really is important to make sure the whole diet is balanced. So I'd love you to go and download the My Happy Horse Nutrition app. It will show you really quickly whether your horse's diet is meeting all of its nutrient requirements or not. And just remember, for your laminitis-prone horses, winter is not a safe time necessarily. So do keep an eye on your pasture, on your non-structural carbohydrate content of your hay, because you can get caught out in winter with laminitis. Sometimes we think about spring and autumn being the risky times, but definitely winter is a risky time as well, particularly at the back end of winter when you're getting close to spring. So whether it is a time your horse needs help holding condition, or it's a useful opportunity to take a little weight off a good doer, really the management practice is the same. So keep watching the horse in front of you, adjust the diet early, and don't wait until things have gone too far. And then, if they lose too much weight, and then it's a big job to put weight back on them. So I hope that helps with feeding in winter. It was always interesting in my time at FeedXL watching how many more people would subscribe to FeedXL during winter, because that's when people would really struggle with nutrition. So I know it's not an easy time for a lot of you to feed horses, but I really do hope that the information here and also the Happy Horse Nutrition app can help you in getting through this winter a lot easier than you may have in the past. If this episode helped you, I'd love you to share it with a friend, and particularly a friend that has a horse who struggles through winter. And thank you very much for being here, and I'll catch you in the next episode. If you'd like to know more about the My Happy Horse virtual equine nutritionist, you can head on over to myhappy.horse. And also while you're there, check out the Dr. Nerida AI, which is me in AI format. And that version of me is happy to answer your questions about horse nutrition 24/7. Thanks again, and we'll catch you soon.